What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. Alpha and Beta was pretty crazy in terms of power level for champions back in the day because actually most of the numbers at the time were based off of the design of Dota. Add in summoner spells into the mix and you've got a formula for an absolute bloodbath, and that's kind of what the Alpha and Beta stage of League of Legends was. A lot of this was just down to overtuned numbers, but a good quarter or so of champions were actually insanely strong just because of broken mechanics alone, and they became really notorious during this time period. There always has to be someone at the top though, so we've compared the different alpha and beta versions of each champions to bring you the top 10 most powerful champions during the alpha and beta of League of Legends. Keep in mind that we're rating how powerful the champions are during only the known patches of beta and alpha, and we're not including any champions that were OP because of bugs. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit that like button, and if you don't, definitely hit that dislike, and let's get started. Starting out at number 10 is actually Evelyn. Remember how we made that video on visual counterplay that Riot's been adding into the game lately a couple days back? Well, back in the day, that wasn't really a thing at all. If Rengar was released back then, he definitely wouldn't have had the little exclamation mark that kindly tells you that you're about to die, and it was no different from Evelyn. She had no indicator to let you know she was nearby, and unlike Rengar, her stealth was pretty much infinite. It was pseudo-infinite. It had a really long duration of over a minute, but a cooldown of like just a few seconds, so if your stealth actually ran out, of course it was already up to cast again. And if that wasn't powerful enough alone, when attacking someone from stealth, she had a 2-second targeted stun. So you're just kind of walking around minding your own business, and then you're locked down for 2 seconds instantly and destroyed. It's not really something we can call fair gameplay, but at least Riot learned from that kind of mistake. Coming in at number 9 is the Donger himself. Heimerdinger is an interesting one because he's honestly not really been changed that much since his release in terms of mechanics, with the exception of some tweaks to his numbers, but still there were a couple of differences between his current and former self that definitely make him worthy of a spot on our list. Mostly the fact that at rank 3 he could spawn up to 6 turrets at once. That's right, you thought 3 Heimerdinger turrets was hard to tower dive, well imagine doubling that completely. On top of that, his E would also deal damage to towers, letting him burst them down pretty quickly, especially with his turrets hammering them away. And don't forget his passive gives him and his turrets health regeneration, so with that many turrets out all gaining health rapidly, it's really difficult to kill them, especially for a tower that can only hit one at a time and would take a couple of shots to actually kill one. It essentially made Heimerdinger the king of sieging, able to just set up a fortress of cannons and totally destroy anything nearby. Next up we have Zillion, and he was released during the League of Legends closed beta with an incredibly broken ultimate. The way it works right now is that if you put a protective rune on an ally, and if they die within 5 seconds they get resurrected with some health and stuff. Now imagine that duration instead of 5 seconds was actually extended to 90 seconds, and you have Zillion's ultimate at rank 3 back in the day. A full minute and a half of protection from death is ridiculously insane to think about, and basically let him give Guardian's Angel to his allies without the resistances, because by the time those 90 seconds were over, you guessed it, his ultimate was off cooldown. This wasn't the only broken part of his kit too though. His E also originally dealt damage to enemies, and his Q also had a 1.1 AP ratio, meaning he gained a crazy amount of damage on his Q when building full AP. Essentially, he was pretty much more powerful in every single way, more damage, more damaging abilities, and even more life-saving power. Of course, Zillion's ultimate Chrono Shift is still strong today when timed properly, but back then you actually use it and pretty much just have it ready again before the buff would expire because of the rewind spell. Pretty insane to think about, honestly. At number 7 we have Trin Amir, pretty suited because one of the parts of his powerful kit in the old days was his 7-second ultimate duration. That's a seriously long amount of time to be unkillable, and it turned Trin Amir into such a huge pain to deal with. That alone wouldn't really make him broken though, but unlike some of the other champions on our list, Trin Amir was so strong because just of a lot of minor things that kind of just added up all together to create this one massive powerhouse. His passive, for example, at the time gave him bonus critical damage, which is pretty insane if you think about it. Crits already do double damage, so at 100% crit, Trin Amir would be able to do even more than double damage with his melee attacks, but he'd have to get that 100% crit and a lot of attack speed first, right? But no, he wouldn't. His Q had a stacking buff that gave attack speed and critical strike chance that stacked up whenever you killed a unit, and it stacked up to 40% critical strike chance and 80% attack speed. And if that wasn't insane enough, you could also activate the Q to heal him based on the number of stacks, and it could heal for as much as up to 800 with base values alone. This was absolutely insane and meant that Trin Amir was one of the most broken duelists in the history of the game, able to deal both insane damage while healing crazy amounts. He didn't even have to worry about stacking up his Q passive actually though, because using his ultimate stacked his Q up to the full number of stacks almost instantly, basically giving you a League of Legends God mode right off the bat with that huge attack speed and critical strike chance buff. Despite all of that, he's only at number 7 too, so just to set the bar a little bit and give you guys an idea of what we're dealing with. At number 6, we actually have Ryze, who's a champion we talked about pretty recently because of his new rework, so it's kind of cool to be able to go back and maybe reflect on how he used to be. His alpha version was probably his most powerful form ever, mostly because of his ultimate. At the time, his ultimate was Spell Flux, the ability that later became his E. But it had one major difference though, it did an absolutely insane amount of base damage. And it could bounce between targets and Ryze of course, which meant that his ultimate alone would just insta-gib an isolated target if you were standing next to them, with almost no way to counterplay. The rest of his kit was no joke either though. His W was actually Mana Leech / Arcane Mastery at the time, a different ability, which gave him bonus damage and mana drain on his basic attacks, which gave him a ton of power outside of spell cast as well to go alongside with his already pretty insane rotation. His passive at the time also gave him a bunch of ability power when he was low on health, so basically if you ever encountered Alpha Ryze by yourself, you had almost no chance to survive, and dealing damage to him would just make him kill you even faster. Breaking into our top 5, we actually have someone that you guys might not have expected, and it's Sion. And his kit should be pretty familiar to any of you that played him pre-rework. His Q was Cryptic Gaze at the time, a targeted stun that dealt magic damage, and that ability was quite frustrating to deal with before his rework, but in alpha it was a lot worse. The stun lasted for 2.2 seconds at first, targeted of course, and it was a part of what made Sion such a terrifying AP bruiser to play against. His W was also a massive part of this. Along with high base damage, it also had a 200% AP ratio. So let's put that into perspective. At level 1 with the Doran's Ring, that would be like 150 damage at level 1 from the ability, alongside the fact that it also gave him that 150 HP shield. Level 2 Sion was probably the strongest out of any level 2 champion in the history of the game, because of those two abilities in the alpha stage, and he didn't drop off at all, he just kept scaling up. Sion would just build tanky AP items along with some cooldown reduction and absolutely crush everyone with his constant stun and massive burst AoE damage. At number 4 we have Jax, probably one that most of you expected to see in here if you watched our History of Jax video. The core of Jax back in alpha and beta was using the dodge mechanic to avoid as much damage as possible. Jax actually got dodge stats really easy because dodge was on Phantom Dancer, and you could stack it to the point where you would even reach as much as 100% dodge chance, or very close to it, letting him dodge pretty much every single auto attack thrown at him, along with shots from turrets, even the base turrets too, as those were also dodgeable at the time. His Empower ability was also an area of effect ability back then, so he could hit multiple enemies while avoiding all of their attacks, and it could even critical strike and proc on hit effects, so Jax was putting out a stupid amount of damage. The big focus has always been on scaling for Jax, and his passive at the time gave him the best scaling in the game, which gave him bonus stats from item purchases. He received more value out of every item than anyone else, could mitigate tons of damage through dodging, and could also deal an insane amount of damage in an area of effect. It made for a pretty damn broken champion and one of the most notorious picks in the history of the game. Charging into our number 3 spot today is Master Yi. During alpha and part of the closed beta, Master Yi's ultimate was his Q, Alpha Strike. It was pretty much just a flat out upgraded version, able to hit up to 10 targets and also would deal a ridiculous amount of damage. It actually had no base damage scaling, but it had a 300% total AD scaling, and it could also critically strike. To put that into perspective, with 400 AD, that would be 1200 damage that could then also critically strike to deal double damage to up to 10 enemies instantly. He could literally one-shot multiple targets without taking a scratch in the late game when he reached a bunch of items. If that wasn't enough to earn his position in our list alone, his Q was his current ultimate, Highlander, only it could also cleanse snares as well as making him immune to slows. We're not finished though, his E was also pretty busted at the time, because currently it just gives him some bonus damage, but back then it was a toggle effect that gave him both bonus damage and also attack speed. It did drain his mana on each attack, but you'd essentially just never turn this ability off since the mana cost wasn't that low, and everyone would be dead long before you actually ran out of mana. Our number 2 pick is actually Kassadin, who's kind of like Trin Amir in that every single part of his kit was just way stronger than it is now, and he has a couple of minor extra mechanics. A lot of this did come down to his damage. Both his AP ratios and base damages were insanely high, so he could delete people way earlier in the game than he can now. His Q also had the trademark silence back then, making it really favorable for trading in lane, and his ultimate had a super short cooldown along with 900 range. He was pretty much impossible to outrun and could kill anyone as long as he had the mana available, which you of course would build for. If you managed to survive long enough to stay alive and run him low on mana though, he had a secret weapon, his W Netherblade, used to actually steal mana when it hit a target. Basically, the biggest weakness of his kit was just his mana pool, and he could just rift walk up to you and drain your mana to use for himself anyway. He gained twice as much mana as what he drained from an enemy, so timing his W properly meant that you would pretty much never actually run dry. He was a little more attack speed based back then, as his passive Void Stone caused him to take reduced damage from abilities and also turn that damage into bonus attack speed, but this pretty much just meant that he could steal more and more mana from you to keep himself topped up. Combine that with his disgusting AP ratios, and of course a 900 range on his ultimate with an incredibly short single-digit cooldown, and you've got one ridiculously strong champion. And of course, at the number 1 spot, most of you probably expected this, it's Twisted Fate. You can pretty much sum this up in a single sentence. I mean, his ultimate was actually a basic ability at the time with a cooldown of 30 seconds. His E was his trademark point-and-click teleport, and at rank 5 he could use it every 30 seconds, not to mention that it was also global and point-and-click. There was literally no escape from Twisted Fate ever, no safe place to hide anywhere. His ultimate at the time was a global slow as well that revealed everyone on the map, and it turned that E into an instant cast effect instead of just channeling it for a few seconds. So if he knew where you were, he could just channel a teleport over instantly. If you didn't know, he'd pop his ultimate and then appear right next to you once again, instantly. Twisted Fate's always been a snowball champion since he was created, but back then it was just mind-blowing to play against. Not to mention his wildcards also did a lot more damage too. Every 30 seconds you'd be dealing with a disadvantage because you'd be fighting against your lane opponent, and then Twisted Fate would just show up randomly. And then by the time the fight was over, Twisted Fate's E was once again off cooldown and he could just teleport right back to lane. If that wasn't bad enough already, his gold card wasn't a single target stun, it was a targeted area of effect stun. He'd pop his global slow to stop your escape and reveal your team's position, instantly teleport next to you, and then stun everyone with his gold card and deal out some massive damage with his wild cards. Probably the most absurdly powerful version of a champion in the entire history of League of Legends, but honestly it's really impressive that Ryze did manage to find a way to balance this kit without really hurting Twisted Fate's identity as a champion. And that just about wraps up our top 10 most powerful alpha or beta champions. This one was really fun to make, and I can't help but feel it'd be really cool if Ryze actually made a game mode where you could maybe go back and try out and play with all those broken kits from the older days of the game. Hope you guys all enjoyed our list, and make sure to let us know your favorite in the comment section below, or perhaps what your list might have looked like. That's going to be it for me. If you guys enjoyed the video, drop a like, subscribe if you want. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.